Hi, I'm Cameron Bailey. I'm the Artistic Director of TIFF. TIFF is the organization that presents the Toronto International Film Festival, as well as programming here at TIFF Bell Lightbox 365 days a year. I'm 53 years old, and my hope is that 50 years from now, that Canadian filmmakers and anybody who makes moving images is making work that's seen by Canadians all across the country and by people all around the world. And my greatest hope is that Indigenous Canadians are at the forefront of Canadian storytelling, because these are Canada's oldest stories and the stories that need to be told. I'm here at TIFF Bell Lightbox, which stands on land that is the land of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat and the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and they share it with all of us, including many of us newcomers to Canada. And my hope is that soon their stories will be shared all around the world with all of the resources that this great country of Canada has.
First of all,
I am honored that I have been asked to leave a message, to be part of this capsule to be open 50 years from now. But I wonder, will there still be some communities without clean water 50 years from now? It is our responsibility, all of us, to make sure that those who have power ensure that all people have clean and clear water. For water is life. Life is sacred. Sacred for all.
Thank you very much, first of all, to Jack for that fascinating, slightly terrifying presentation, as well as to Cameron Bailey and Alana Sabopsuan for contributing those heartfelt messages to the Canada 150 time capsule. I'd also like to welcome those of you who are joining us via live stream, sponsored by the Canada Media Fund, to close off Primetime in Ottawa 2017. Our final keynote is someone I'm sure you all know quite well. Jesse Wente is, of course, a mainstay on Toronto's Metro Morning. He's been its resident film and pop culture critic for 20 years now. In addition to his work on Metro Morning, Jesse serves as the Director of Film Programs at TIFF Bell Lightbox. He has curated retrospectives on the works of Tim Burton, Stanley Kubrick, Michael Mann, and Keanu Reeves, but much of his work has focused on promoting and celebrating Indigenous cinema, as well as bringing it to a larger audience. Not only has he curated many retrospectives in some of the greats of Indigenous cinema, he has continuously promoted emerging voices in Indigenous filmmaking, both in Canada and around the world. Jesse's work has unquestionably raised the profile of both Canadian and Indigenous cinema globally, but most importantly, over the past 20 years, his effusive passion for the art of film has spurred his listeners to care about film just as much as he does. It's with great pleasure that I invite you to welcome Jesse Wente.
Wow, I need to get that for all my appearances. Ani Bojo, it's always great to be back here on unceded Algonquin territory. I thank them for hosting us all here today, and indeed for hosting all that we see around us every day. My ancestors feel welcome here, Miigwech. You see, I'm Anishinaabe. The Algonquins are like our cousins, and my ancestors always travel with me, as do those that have not yet joined us here, the future generations. They travel with me too, and it's for both of them that I speak here today, and anywhere and anytime I do any of these sorts of talks. But I am thrilled here today. This is my first time at Primetime. I never imagined this is how I would come here to this event, but thank you all for staying. I know the urge to rush out must be great. And I see many familiar faces here. I hope to meet some new ones. And I always love to be surrounded by storytellers. That's my real passion. So it's great to be in a room full of people who tell stories. And as I hope will become clear over the next 20-ish minutes, I think the stories are more important now than they have ever been, certainly in my lifetime. Now, I landed here on the stage because of a phone conversation I had with Marguerite. And if you've ever talked on the phone with Marguerite, you know that is filled with delights and surprises. And my surprise was ending up here today. And so I've adapted that phone conversation for the talk, but just so you know, if at any moment I do have to put you on hold because E1 or Elevation is calling, hey, that's just business. That's how it goes. I get asked to talk about a lot of things these days, about Indigenous issues, Indigenous storytelling, Canada 150, truth and reconciliation. And as I do this more and more, traveling across this country, internationally doing these talks, I begin to understand why there's such an interest. I mean, we're at a very interesting moment. Here and globally, there's a lot going on, as you can all check your phones and see what has happened just moments ago, maybe. I'm scared to look at this point. Canada is celebrating its sesquicentennial this year, and birthdays, as you all know, are a great time for celebration, but also reflection on our past. And this comes on the heels of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It comes as the inquiry into the epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women in this country is ongoing. And it comes when Indigenous voices are louder than ever. Thanks to social media, alternative media, including some of the mediums you've heard about here this week at this conference. And the appetite for this content is greater than ever. I mean, I've been at this for 21 years, but I have never been asked to speak at so many places. And I think that's evidence, not of me, of more of interest in the subject of anything else. For example, on Wednesday night, almost 500 people attended a screening of the series Rise at the TIFF Bell Lightbox. The new series on Viceland by Toronto filmmaker, Algonquin and Métis filmmaker, I should say, Michelle Latimer. Earlier this month, I attended the Sundance Film Festival, which premiered 9 Indigenous works, the most in the history of that festival. The interest is there because after 150 years, we're finally trying to know each other. That's what Canada 150 is. For the first time really in its history, that Canada is trying to know its Indigenous people. And what's the best way to get to know someone? Through stories, of course, through stories. But of course, colonial states know that. That's why they obscure and steal stories and create new ones to support the colonial state. As Canada celebrates 150 years, I gotta be honest, a lot of Indigenous people, myself included, will not be joining in those celebrations. See, it's a bit tricky, because I heard the minister yesterday say that truth and reconciliation, or reconciliation anyway, we'll leave the truth part out, she didn't mention it. Reconciliation with Indigenous people is not only part of the 3 pillars of their social contract, but is a big part of Canada 150. But to be honest, for Indigenous people, Canada 150 is what we're trying to reconcile. I'm not sure we can celebrate what we're actually trying to come to grips with. And I'll give you, I'm empathetic with the struggles Canadians are having with this, because reconciliation is new to Canada. It's not new to Indigenous people. We reconcile our existence here all the time. We are a post-apocalyptic people. We have seen our world end, and we live in its ruins. We live among the walking dead. We understand. And so, when I wake up in the morning, like most Indigenous people, I'm already in a mode of reconciliation. I'm reconciling the fact that, like many of us, and like the Turo Wampum, that is the agreement, the foundational agreement of this land, that many of us have feet in 2 different paths. We have feet in the Indigenous path, and we have a path in the settler newcomer world. And we have to reconcile that. I have to reconcile that I'm still here when so many of my people in my family are not. And they are not here, and that has allowed me to be here. And that's tough. We have to reconcile that as well. So we've got a leg up. We're used to reconciling. We do it every single day. But the rest of Canada, it's new. So I understand the discomfort. When we celebrate, when the fireworks happen and all that happens, I think it's key to remember that everything we're celebrating, or people will be celebrating about Canada, is built upon the violent oppression of Indigenous people. Everything that we love about Canada, everything that we are going to celebrate in July, comes from that. All the privilege that we have as Canadians, the idea that the world needs more Canada. That is all because of what happened to Indigenous people on this land. And as we think of sitting at 150 years, I would ask that you guys begin to think about how you reconcile that in your daily lives. It's incredibly important. And I'll get to a little bit about strategies, but all of those things we hold dear, they exist at the cost of the culture, sovereignty, land, language, and lives of this land's original people. So the role of stories is going to be incredibly important. And I want to take us back a little bit, not quite 150 years, but to 137 years ago, which is when the Indian Act was created in Canada. Canada was only 9 years old when it created the Indian Act. So not quite, still a child. And the Indian Act has created what created the reserve system in Canada. It gave the government the ability to control who was Indigenous, gave them control over Indigenous identity, and it embedded the residential school system into our country. 4 years later, when Canada became a teenager, it amended the Indian Act and passed a law called the Potlatch Ban. And the Potlatch Ban outlawed Indigenous ceremonies like the potlatch and the Sundance all across the country. It made easy the theft of our cultural property into colonial museums where they are still on display. The Indian Act allowed the government to steal our stories. The Potlatch Ban was a law for 71 years, for more than 70 years in Canada, until 1951. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada were born and died having never heard their stories. Whole generations have never had a chance to hear their stories. Now, of course, I'm angry about that. Among other things that this colonial state has done to my family and my people, that's one that upsets me. But you know who else should be angry? You should be angry. Okay? Because the one thing colonialism steals culture, land, sovereignty, people. It's taken all that from me, but it's also taken all of that from you. The land we sit on now has been the home of the Algonquin people for 13,000 years. 13,000. 150 seems maybe a little less impressive when you consider the long scope of history. And how much richer would your understanding of Canada, the place you now call home, be if you had all of those stories? How much greater would this year's celebration be if we already knew each other? If we already had a common understanding? Think of all that knowledge that has been lost, not just to me, but to you. Okay? Imagine if you knew our stories already. You might already know us. And if Canada truly knew us, it would be harder to hate and easier to love, because it's really hard to love what you don't know. It's really hard. Maybe if Canada knew us, we would be equals instead of mascots for your sports teams and your summer camps. Maybe it would be harder to let our communities go without clean drinking water. There was 93 communities like that in Canada last time I checked. Maybe it would be harder to break the treaties, which are the true foundational documents of this country. We are all treaty people here, unless you're out in the West where they haven't even signed treaties yet. And you all have obligations in those treaties. It's not just Indigenous people, it's the rest of Canada as well. Maybe it would be harder to let our children go with less than all other children. Maybe it would be harder to steal our children. Maybe if Canada knew our stories, it wouldn't stand by and watch our children take their own lives. Canadians should be angry that this was taken from them as well. It's kept you strangers on the land you now call home. And listen, I understand, this is not always easy. Hearing these stories after all these years is hard. It's hard to tell them, and it's hard to hear them. Our stories have pain and trauma, I fully admit, and that is the truth we face every day. But our stories also have everything that storytellers like yourselves love. There's romance and adventure, action and drama, monsters and ghosts, sex and violence. All the things we love to put in our stories. They're all there. They're all there. And let me tell you, these are all sellable stories, stories that you, Canada, and the world are going to want to hear. Now, the truth is, I'm not actually sure the government knows what reconciliation is. They talk about it a lot. The minister spoke about it yesterday here. Because I think they want it to be one thing. They want it to be forgiveness. They want it to be an acknowledgement that we're going to move on and get over it. But honestly, that's not what reconciliation is. And points out one of the fundamental challenges of reconciliation in Canada, which is that colonial governments are not built for reconciliation. They're built for the exact opposite of that. And while the minister can come here and say that reconciliation is a major part of their social contract, that it's a major part of Canada 150, well, she was saying that to you yesterday. I was over there, and I looked down on my phone, and I saw a message from the chief of the Black Lake Nation in northern Saskatchewan, who said that in the last 6 weeks, 30 youth have attempted to kill themselves in that community. And when I look at the minister, I ask, is that what reconciliation looks like? When they're cutting funding to mental health centers in the north, when access to these services are limited, I'm not sure that's the reconciliation Indigenous people have in mind. No, I don't think reconciliation will come from the government or come from large institutions of this nation. Again, they're not really built for it. And if they were honest with themselves, they would actually admit that they don't really want it. Not really. They're terrified of the cost. That's colonialism, folks. It measures the value of lives and the cost it is. And let me tell you, the vast majority of the time, the cost for Indigenous lives is perceived too high. The value of those lives, far too low to be worth it. That's why so much of my focus isn't actually talking to institutions, although I do that. My focus is really talking to individuals like you, because I think that's where change happens in our society. It doesn't happen on the institutional level. It happens on the personal, intimate, everyday, micro-change level. The level changes you guys can make in your daily lives, at your work, at your home, that can change this nation. When you think of great social progress, when you think of the civil rights movement, when you think of what's happened with the LGBTQ two-spirit community in the last few years, that didn't happen because governments wanted it to happen. That happened because people like you wanted those changes to happen. So Canadians have to decide that this is actually something that they're going to force. And when ministers sit up here and say reconciliation is a big part of their platform, it requires not just me to stand up and ask. They've heard enough from me. It actually requires you guys to stand up and ask. Okay, they already know what I feel. The minister's heard me speak before. She gets it. She's heard it. But you guys, it's your help that we truly need in it. In this room are the storytellers, and I believe you can help make this change by helping us and letting us tell our stories. When my grandmother came out of that school in Northern Ontario, she came out ashamed of who she was. She came out without her language that she had when she went in, and she came out without our stories. So I didn't grow up with them. And so for us, our stories are our survival. For us, this isn't about making a movie deal. It isn't about getting on Netflix or iTunes. It isn't about any of that. This is about life and death for us, because our stories is what helped us sustain ourselves, and it's what is going to help us come back again. And we will come back again. It's inevitable. That's why it's so important to us that we get a chance to tell them ourselves. Because again, our stories have been told by others for many, many, many years. And that's really what has helped contribute to getting us to this place where we are now. That's why some of us are lobbying very hard for dedicated funds to tell our stories, because for us, this isn't about, as I said, a deal. This is about survival. Not just for us, but Canada's, by the way. Because I think too often we separate the notion that these things are separate, that Indigenous excellence or rise somehow comes at a cost to everything else. It does not. It'll boost the whole thing. Canada, this is Turtle Island still. You guys call it Canada, you call it US, we call it Turtle Island. It's always been that way. It will always be that way. This was native land, it's lay native land right now, it will be native land in the future. One of the things the elders have taught me is when I look around at all these structures, not just the physical ones, but those are all temporary. The land is what's permanent. The land is what's permanent. So we have to keep that in mind as we go forward. Indigenous people, and reconciliation is not about doing new things. The TRC Commissioner, Marie Wilson, told me this. It's not about doing new things. Reconciliation is about doing all things differently. All things. Because a lot of what we've done is what has gotten us here. We have, as we like to say in our industry, proof of concept on this. We've seen what happens. We don't need to repeat it. Alanis, who I can't believe I'm following a message from Alanis Obomsawin, but go watch her new movie, We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. That should be the mantra for all of Canada right now. And yet I see every day we're making it again and again and again. So we got to get out of this system. And unlocking these stories, now some of us are fond of saying, and when I get back to the idea of letting us tell our stories, some of us like to say nothing about us without us. And when we talk about reconciliation and we talk about notions of consultation versus consent, that applies not just to pipelines and mining developments, that also does apply to our stories. And for too long, it's been about consultation and not about consent. And getting out our stories, these rich stories that are of this land, is a different path. There's protocols to follow, permissions to receive. There's all sorts of steps to take. But what I can assure you is that your story will be better for taking the steps. And even better than that, you will be better for taking the steps. That's actual reconciliation. It may take longer to get the story out. You may have to visit people in their community. You may have to talk it through. That's actual reconciliation. That's going to change you as a person, and as a result, you're going to change Canada as a country. But I'll tell you what, I know there's been much discussion around the future of storytelling here this week, from the forms it might take, from VR to AR to full-on Videodrome, whatever that is, that movie Existence that David made where you plug something right into your spine. I'm sure that'll be, 50 years from now, I'm sure that's what it'll be here. We're discussing how you plug into your spine. As well as where it shall be shown and how it will be funded. I mean, there's nothing more fun than to talk about OTT and ISP content creation obligations, right, Reynolds? Where is he? Good times, good times. All important topics and vital to the future of our industry. But to be honest, when I think about the future of storytelling, I don't necessarily think about the forms it's going to take, where that is going to happen. I actually think about who is telling the stories and what stories they're telling. Because I actually think that's the future of storytelling, is opening up who gets to tell stories in our culture. And this doesn't apply just to Indigenous people. I mean, we've heard about the incredible work being done to equalize the opportunity for women storytellers to get their stories out. But it doesn't stop there. It's all marginalized people. That's the real future of storytelling. It's not the what, it's the who. And that's actually going to fundamentally change how we see ourselves, how we see the country, how we relate to the world. You guys already know stories are incredible tools of empathy. They're one of the most powerful ways to get us to care about each other. And what do we need more in the world right now than empathy? I mean, maybe if we had more empathy, some wouldn't feel the need to go to a mosque with a gun. And some people wouldn't feel the need to defend that. And maybe some people wouldn't feel the need to lock out immigrants or demonize others. Because all of that, I got to be honest with you folks, is colonialism too. One of the great things about it's not a great thing, but one of the truths about colonial states is when they feel threatened, and the thing that threatens colonial states the most is the fear of being colonized. It's true. We think that they don't remember, but states do remember. I think colonial states are very, very much in tune with the fact that their wealth, their privilege all came at the cost of Indigenous people. So the fear that the violence and oppression that they used to gain their privilege might be turned against them is deeply rooted. So what do? They turn policies of isolation and assimilation outwards. The same policies they used to turn inwards to the people that were here first, they now turn outwards. They attack ceremony, like a mosque, and they attack language. It's the same systems over and over again, and it serves the same number of people. And if we truly want to reconcile, we have to understand that has to change. Not just here, but globally. Now, I believe that you can make the change. I hear a lot about how the scripts are bad or not good enough in Canada. Are we looking in the same places, I would ask? Where are the scripts coming from? Are they from the same people over and over again? Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we need different script writers to produce different scripts, different producers and directors to produce different work. As leaders in this industry, that means you can make this change. And I believe that you can, because I believe that storytellers in their hearts already know the power of story. You already know that this world needs more empathy and that you're here to fill it. And while there is great reason to be afraid now, that should only reinforce the need for stories. I mean, if this last month has taught us anything, it's that we need to tell more stories to each other so we can know each other a little bit better. Because in a world where connectivity and sharing is a button click away, I worry that we actually share less now than we did. And I mean true sharing, sitting in a room with people, having a shared experience. We do that less now. It's easier to connect, but harder to make a connection. And we have to, as storytellers, overcome those obstacles. We need to tell more and more different stories than we ever have before. Now, I want to leave you with one last thought. I look out and I see a room full of creators, people who make things, who make art, who tell stories. And I want to say to you that you're already doing something, which is creating. And this is incredibly, incredibly important. Because colonialism, and if the goal here is to decolonize, I hear a lot about that, decolonize, I'm all for that. Let's decolonize. Well, colonialism, if we look at it, is an extraction business. And I use those words precisely. Colonialism takes what it wants from land, from people, from a culture, and it discards everything else. So one of the great ways you can decolonize and fight those forces is to create. Because creation isn't extraction, it's the exact opposite. So if you want to decolonize, make more. Encourage more people to make more things, more art. In this time, I mean, Winston Churchill said, if we're not for art, what are we fighting for? And that's true whether we're at war or whether we have to take direct actions against oppressive governments, oppressive leaders. That's what we fight for. Because art, again, is our stories. People often ask me, where can I find this? Indigenous art, even when they took our stories away from us, go back and look. Our stories are all there. The truth is still all there. You just need to see it, and we need to share it. And we need to not be afraid that in Canada, the history of Indigenous storytelling has often been one related to trauma. But that is as much about opportunity and access as it is about the stories themselves. That's as much about the stories we've been given permission to tell as it is the truth of who we are. We are all things, just like you are. Comedy, laughter, all of that. We just need the opportunity to share those stories and to tell them. So let's spend the next 150 years creating and not extracting. If we do that together, and I appreciate the time capsule's been about 50 years, I tend to think that it took us 150 years to get here, it might take us 150 years to get back. So if you all agree to join me here in 150 years, I plan to be here. I don't know about you guys laughing. If we come back in 150 years and we've spent 150 years telling new Indigenous stories, if we've spent 150 years creating together and not extracting, if we spent 150 years honoring the treaties, if we do that, then we will make a much better Canada. we will make a much better world. And in 150 years, when we come back together in this room, we will truly have something to celebrate. Truly. And that is what I want. I want my children to be free and happy on the land that their people have occupied for 13,000 years. Just like I hope the same for you. And so together, let's tell more and more stories. Let's look for different storytellers to do it. And in 150 years, we will all celebrate together. Chi miigwech for listening.
Jesse, you're getting a standing ovation. Jesse, you're getting a standing ovation. What a thoughtful, thought-provoking, I'd even say paradigm-shifting presentation. And we were inspired, and we have our marching orders. We know what we need to do, and we each have a role to play in furthering reconciliation in our country. So a huge thank you to Jesse for ending this conference